stand at the very edge of the continent on a stormy, moonless night. The darkness of the ocean is absolute. It is a terrifying, formless void. For centuries, the boundary between the safety of the land and the violence of the sea was invisible. But if you looked up, slicing through the heavy fog and the crashing rain, you might see a single, brilliant beam of light sweeping quietly across the horizon. We often look at lighthouses today as romantic, peaceful monuments. We buy postcards of their white towers standing tall against blue skies. But behind that steady, reassuring flash of light was a massive, heavy, and exhausting system of gears, glass, and relentless human discipline. To keep the coast safe in the 19th century, humanity did not just build towers. We built giant, precision clockworks that housed small, fragile fires, tended to by solitary individuals who fought a quiet, nightly war against soot, friction, and exhaustion. This is the story of the classical lighthouse keeper and the invisible machinery that guided the world's ships. In the early days of maritime navigation, fighting the darkness was a matter of brute force. Communities would light massive bonfires of wood or coal on hilltops or inside crude stone towers. But an open fire is a terribly inefficient signal. The vast majority of its light escapes directly up into the night sky or spills down onto the ground below. To a ship miles out at sea, struggling in a storm, a massive bonfire looks like a dim, flickering star, easily lost in the rain. The problem was not just making a brighter fire. The problem was controlling where the light went. If you tried to put a giant, solid magnifying glass in front of a fire to focus it, the glass would have to be incredibly thick, impossibly heavy, and it would absorb too much of the light it was trying to project. The solution came in 1822, when a French physicist named Augustin Jean Fresnel presented a revolutionary new optical system. While others had theorized similar concepts, Fresnel developed a practical, working system that would change the coastlines of the world forever. The following year, a complete first-order lens, based on his design, was installed at the Cordouan Lighthouse in France. Fresnel's genius was to take the curved surface of a massive lens and collapse it into a series of concentric, stepped rings of glass. He removed all the unnecessary bulk, creating a complex, beautiful structure that looked like a giant, glowing glass beehive. When a small oil lamp was placed precisely at the focal point inside this beehive, something magical happened. The central rings of the lens refracted the light straight ahead, but more importantly, the upper and lower rings of glass prisms captured the stray light, the light that would normally be wasted on the sky or the floor, and bent it perfectly outward. Instead of a scattered glow, the Fresnel lens gathered the weak light of an oil lamp and threw it into a concentrated, horizontal beam that could pierce through miles of darkness. These lenses were categorized by orders. A first-order lens, meant for major coastal points, could stand over 8 feet tall and weigh several tons, composed of hundreds of individual, hand-polished glass prisms set into a heavy brass frame. Smaller orders, like the 5th or 6th, were used for quiet harbors and rivers. But creating a brilliant, focused beam of light was only half the battle. If a lighthouse only displayed a steady, fixed light, a sailor might confuse it for a star or a lantern in a coastal house. To truly identify a location, the light needed a characteristic. It needed to flash. And to make a light flash, you had to rotate the entire multi-ton glass beehive around the stationary flame. How do you rotate a structure weighing thousands of pounds smoothly, evenly, and continuously throughout the night, decades before electric motors were invented? You build a giant clock. Beneath the magnificent glass optic was a heavy brass and iron pedestal housing a clockwork mechanism. It operated exactly like a grandfather clock, driven by the pure, silent force of gravity. A thick cable or chain was wrapped around a metal drum, attached to a heavy iron weight. This weight, often weighing hundreds of pounds, was suspended in a hollow vertical shaft inside the lighthouse tower, known as the weightway. When the keeper released the brake, gravity slowly pulled the heavy weight down the center of the tower. This downward pull turned the drum, which engaged a series of precision gears, slowly rotating the massive lens above. To prevent the weight from simply crashing to the bottom, the mechanism included a governor, a spinning fan blade that used air resistance to keep the rotation at a perfectly constant speed. In early systems, the heavy optic rolled on small metal chariot wheels, which created significant friction. But by the 1890s, engineers like Léon Bourdelle introduced the mercury float. The entire multi-ton lens was seated in a cast iron trough filled with liquid mercury. Floating on this dense liquid metal, the friction was reduced to almost nothing. You could push a 2-ton glass lens with the gentle push of a single finger. But this beautiful, self-contained universe of glass and brass could not operate on its own. It required human hands. It required the lighthouse keeper. The life of a keeper was not a life of staring thoughtfully at the ocean. It was a life of rigorous, dirty, and exhausting technical maintenance. The instructions issued by authorities like Trinity House in England or the U.S. Lighthouse Board were incredibly strict. A lighthouse station was never, under any circumstances, to be left unattended. The keeper's day began precisely at sunrise. When the light was extinguished, the real work started. The keeper had to immediately prepare the apparatus for the next evening. The oil lamps had to be dismantled and cleaned. The glass chimneys, which often blackened with soot overnight, had to be polished. The hundreds of fragile prisms of the Fresnel Lens had to be wiped down with soft linen to remove any trace of oil, dust, or salt spray. Then came the fuel. Before the era of pipelines or electricity, lighting the dark required hauling liquid fuel up hundreds of spiral stairs by hand. Keepers carried heavy, covered metal cans of whale oil, lard oil, or later, highly flammable kerosene from a dedicated oil house in the yard all the way up to the lantern room. For safety, as seen in stations like Assateague in 1892, the main supply of kerosene was kept in a separate brick building to prevent the entire tower from going up in flames. As the sun began to set, the keeper climbed the stairs once more. They filled the lamp reservoirs. They meticulously trimmed the cotton wicks. A wick cut too high would smoke and cover the expensive lens in thick black soot. A wick cut unevenly would create a flickering, unfocused flame. The center of the flame had to sit at the exact, mathematically calculated focal point of the giant lens. Once the lamp was lit and the clockwork brake released, the night watch began. The keeper could not simply go to sleep. They had to monitor the flame, adjusting the wicks to keep the light steady. They had to watch the glass windows of the lantern room, wiping away condensation or scraping off ice during winter storms. And, most importantly, they had to wind the clockwork. Because the drop of the iron weight was limited by the height of the tower, it would eventually hit the bottom. At the Point Reyes Lighthouse in California, for example, A 170-pound weight dropped 17 feet over the course of 2 hours and 20 minutes. Before that time was up, the keeper had to insert a heavy hand crank and physically winch the massive weight back up to the top of the tower, over and over again, in the cold and the dark, until the sun finally rose. This was the discipline of light, a quiet, unyielding routine that kept the coastline safe for over a century. But like all physical systems born in the 19th century, the era of the human lighthouse keeper was destined to slowly fade, replaced by the invisible forces of automation. The decline of the keeper did not happen overnight, and it was not solely caused by modern GPS. It was a gradual, layered transition. It began in the early 20th century with the introduction of acetylene gas. Inventors like Gustave Lens created the sun valve, a brilliant mechanical device that used the expansion of metal under sunlight to automatically cut off the flow of gas during the day and open it at night. Suddenly, smaller beacons could flash for months without a human ever touching them. In 1922, Trinity House automated the St. Thomas Lighthouse using exactly this acetylene technology. Then came electrification. Stations were wired for power, replacing the meticulously trimmed oil wicks with bright electric bulbs. Facilities like Esseteague were electrified in 1933, utilizing astronomical clocks to automatically turn the lights on and off. They installed automatic lamp changers, which would instantly rotate a fresh bulb into place if the primary one burned out. Slowly, the heavy iron weights and the hand cranks were removed, replaced by small, reliable electric motors. By the post-war decades of the 1960s through the 1980s, Coast Guards and lighthouse authorities around the world began massive automation programs. Telemetry allowed headquarters to monitor the health of a light from miles away. The daily human presence was no longer an absolute necessity. The resident keepers packed up their belongings, closed the heavy wooden doors of their quarters, and walked down the spiral stairs for the last time. Teams of traveling technicians took their place, visiting only for periodic maintenance. Today, the occupation of the traditional lighthouse keeper is almost completely vanished. The magnificent, multi-ton glass beehives of Augustin Jean Fresnel have largely been removed from their coastal towers, carefully dismantled, and placed into the quiet halls of maritime museums. In their place, sitting inside the empty lantern rooms, are small, highly efficient acrylic lenses and LED arrays powered by solar panels. They are incredibly reliable. They require almost no maintenance. They flash with cold, digital precision. But there is a certain quiet poetry to what we have left behind. The next time you see a lighthouse flashing against the dark horizon, think of the era before the electric switch. Think of the smell of kerosene, the rhythmic ticking of the heavy brass clockwork, the slow rotation of a 2-ton glass beehive floating on mercury, and the solitary individual who stayed awake in the freezing dark, ensuring that the light would never, ever go out.